Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hiaka ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei, mauri ora. Last session, we looked at how rubrics can support clarity by providing a clear picture for us as kaiako and for our ākonga as where we're headed in our learning. A rubric alone is far less powerful than when used with today's focus of examples and non-examples, which strengthen clarity further. This week, we're answering the pātai, where am I now? As per all of our Te Hiku AfL introduction webinars, we will begin with the why behind our focus of clarity, followed by an overview and applications of our focus strategy for examples and non-examples, then looking at barriers and enablers, and then over to you to plan how you can use this aspect and strategy with your ākonga in your kura. Last session, we talked about how it's important to make sure that all ākonga understand the big picture, destination, or end goal of their learning. This can be a global learning intention, the outcome for a unit of work within one learning area or integrated across two or more learning areas, or simply the learning intention and success criteria for one lesson. Knowing the what, why, and how is a key motivator for learning. However, this is not the only thing we can or should do to ensure clarity. Being able to answer the question, where am I now in my learning, is tricky to answer if you don't know what good and not so good look like. A generic description of the learning intention and success criteria are important to show ākonga that the intended learning is transferable across a range of contexts, which can be done verbally, written, or pictorially, ideally all three. Learning intention should always be supported with a diverse range of scaffolded examples, exemplars, and models that students can interact with to see, hear, and feel what the intended learning looks like. All too often, we miss this step out by going straight from the, this is what we're going to learn, I'll show you one example, now you do it. By finding or creating a good range of examples, which has been made far easier and quicker thanks to AI, and deliberately planning how students will engage with these examples and non-examples to identify the steps of the success criteria, we are better able to support our ākonga to gain greater clarity of the intended learning, but also to identify what they can do already. Where am I now? Another great reason to use examples and non-examples is that it helps to reduce cognitive load for students, so the new learning is more likely to stick and to build on prior knowledge. Some learning areas are much more intuitive in terms of providing multiple examples and breaking down the success criteria into easily understood and rehearsable steps, such as PE, technology, and art, whereas in other areas it takes more thought and planning. Use of examples and non-examples can support all 5 aspects of assessment for learning. Whilst our lens today is through the aspect of clarity, use of examples, exemplars, and non-examples also support all 4 other aspects of AFL. Kaiako, for example, could set up a processing task for students to use a success criteria or rubric to assess a provided example of work, which will support Kaiako to elicit evidence of learning for their ākonga. This activity also helps students to feel some ownership of their learning and allows them to provide feedback on an anonymous piece of mahi that subsequently provides feedback to them. If engineered as a pair or group task, this also supports the aspects of students as resources for each other as they share and critique each other's thinking. Effective and regular use of examples or exemplars are a great way to grow and strengthen our Kāhui core focus of tū tangata marama, as well as many of our muri whenua iwi aspirations. Students make progress when they develop the ability to monitor their own work. To do this well, they need to understand what quality work looks like. Examining examples and models of quality work helps to develop this. And they also need to understand how to compare and evaluate their own work against such criteria. Peer assessment and self-assessment help to develop this too. Knowledge of both curriculum and pedagogical content knowledge is essential for effective assessment for learning. Teachers require deep knowledge of the content to be taught and how students learn it. This means having a clear understanding of the concepts and a sense of the likely understandings and misunderstandings students will bring to the classroom and how best to facilitate new learning. There's a range of ways that exemplars, examples, and non-examples can be used to support kaiako and ākonga clarity, as mentioned on the previous slide. Today, we are examining the simple strategy called example or non-examples. This strategy can be facilitated digitally or on paper, orally, visually, individually, in pairs or groups, which should be determined based on the topic, the content, and your students' needs. There's a really simple 3-step success criteria for this strategy. And the first step is to find or create a range of examples and non-examples for the learning focused. Next, these are provided to the ākonga to consider if they are an example or a non-example. Finally, students share their decision and rationale. These 3 steps can be facilitated in a number of different ways, such as on a screen, one by one, the whole class share their thoughts after each is shown, or the whole set could be provided to pairs or groups and they sort them into 2 piles with a discussion to process. Or an individual activity could be provided where students provide digitally on paper their decision making. The following slides provide a different way of facilitating this strategy for a range of content in different learning areas. This simple strategy draws students' attentions to the deep structure of the concept with the use of examples, the boundaries of the concept with the non-examples, and also prompts students to elaborate about the connections and differences among the examples and non-examples to deepen their understanding and clarity of the concepts. We're often discouraged when we face trials and challenges in our lives. We reach the point where we just want to give up. Mistakes and failures are ingredients to success and the best way to learn. By providing multiple, small, bite-sized examples and non-examples, we're supporting our ākonga to see that the more you make mistakes to start with, the more you eventually learn, and that the storms and sunshine allow you to see the rainbow at the end of the day. He iti hau marangai e tū te pā hoka hoka. Just like a rainbow after the storm, success follows failure. So the enablers and barriers are similar as they generally are for all of the assessment for learning strategies. Pre-planning is absolutely essential. Modelling first to ensure the students understand the process, and grouping students who can support each other and are able to discuss the examples together are going to definitely help to make this a success. Barriers, as always, are just giving up after the first try. If this is a new strategy for you, then keep having a go, keep practicing, explain to the students that you're learning too. And then both of you and the ākonga will get used to it. And as always, the reverse of any of the enablers will also be barriers. So the first example we've got today is an English example, which I've created as a group activity. So this would be probably for phase 1, but could be phase 2, depending on the needs and where your students are at the moment. So the pārtai āko, the learning question or learning intention, where should we use capital letters? So we've got the rationale, which is a big motivator for students to understand why they should learn where capital letters go. And then we've got a simple success criteria, which I've aimed at phase 1. So capital letters need to be where names are at the beginning of a sentence, for a title, and when you're writing the word I as a pronoun about yourself. So the task the students are going to do is to highlight the sentences that correctly use capital letters, using the success criteria on the previous slide to guide them. They're then going to highlight the sentences that do not have the correct capitalization, and they're going to use a green highlighter for this, going with our green for growth tickled pink process we've previously talked about on a teacher only day. C, they're going to discuss their decision with the whole group, and then as an extension, they could actually rewrite the incorrect sentences if that's at the appropriate level for your students. So I've done an example to start with, so I'm modelling the process to the students. So I've highlighted this first sentence, A, pink, because it uses it correctly, and I would go through the success criteria and we would discuss how it's using capitalisation in the correct way. There's 2 examples here, one at the beginning of a sentence and one for a place name. And then I've highlighted green the next sentence, which is step B, because there are lots of incorrect things in here. So we should have a W at the beginning of the sentence. Went isn't a name of a place, and it's not the pronoun I, and it's not at the beginning, so that shouldn't have a capital letter. Gisborne and Easter should both have capitals, and holiday shouldn't. And then if you want to do the extension, we've rewritten that out as an example for students to model to them. So C, I've just used a picture to show the students discussing that step. And then there's a link to a document in these slides and also in the Rauami, the resources at the end, for a whole list of sentences that you could use where they could do this activity. So this is one example of how you can use examples and non-examples with Tickle Pink Green for Growth, and it can be done in pairs. The next example is a maths activity. So again, I've aimed this at phase 1 to make sure that we're being inclusive of all of our tamariki and kaiako. So our pātaiako for this is, what are different 2D shapes called? We've got the rationale there, and then 5-step success criteria for the common 2D shapes that we need students to understand and be able to name in phase 1. So teacher would explain verbally to the students, for each example I show you, discuss with your partner if you think this is an example or a non-example of the shape I name. In this activity, we're also using the traffic lights, which we've got another webinar about if you're not familiar with that. So that's all students have their own set of red, orange and green cards. And for this example, if you decide that the example I give you is a non-example, then you would hold up your red card. If you think it is an example, you hold up your green card. And if you're not sure or you can't agree with your partner, then you're going to hold up the orange card. I'm going to count down from 3, and when I get to 1, everyone's going to hold their cards up. So I wouldn't have all of these examples on the screen at once. I would go through them one at a time, and you basically show the students the shape, and then it's from the discussions you have, and you see a sea of colours, hopefully all the right colour that you're looking for. And if not, that gives you the formative assessment information you need to know that maybe they haven't quite understood circles or squares or triangles. It also brings in some common misconceptions, which is like with the example of the triangular prism there. There's actually an example of a rectangle and a triangle in that shape, but the shape itself is a 3D shape rather than a 2D one. They could also look at this window example, which actually you could discuss how many triangles it's got in there, how you know that each of them is triangles. So there's lots of rich discussion you can have as a result of the examples that have been provided. The third example I've got today is for health and PE. Pātaiako, what is assertive communication and why is it important? This is actually at level 4 of the curriculum, so for our older tamariki. And I've got a 6-step success criteria here, which I have labelled with letters. So they're going to use those letters in the strategy for examples and non-examples on the next slide. So they would actually have those that success criteria in their letters visible somewhere in the room or individually. So the ākonga are provided with a range of statements, and they could do this individually or in pairs or in a group. Again, you would be guided by the needs of your students and where they're at, whether you want to get individual information or whether you're more interested in the discussion. So they would be provided with a list of statements. And again, this could be done digitally or on paper, and there's a range of different ways you could do it digitally. If you think they need the physical sorting, I would print it out on paper. So I just used ChatGPT and I asked it to provide me some examples and non-examples of assertive communication with the previous criteria that was on the previous slide. So students would cut and paste, if they were using it digitally, the statements from the list into the table for examples and non-examples. And then they would say which of the criteria the examples and non-examples were meeting or were not meeting. Again, I would encourage discussion between people on this to try and justify the reasoning. And another extension is that they could actually rewrite the non-examples to be more suited to the assertive communication criteria. And the final example we've got today is a science example, a pūtaiao example. How do we know if something's living or non-living? This is aimed at level 3 of the New Zealand curriculum, so still looking at the 2007 curriculum at the moment until we get the release of the refreshed science curriculum. So you've got a clear success criteria there using Mrs. C. Gren. And students this time are just going to use a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So again, I would not have all of these statements visible to students. So you can either have them on a slide to pop up, or you can literally just read them out. So I would ask them to put their thumbs up or down to tell me whether they think we're just focusing on the criteria of life process of movement. So we're only doing one of them because this is early on in the learning. And I want to see if they really understand what movement in a living thing is. So I would take it in turns to read out each of the statements and get the whole class to, from a 3 to 1, to hold up a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So I'm not going to go through all those statements, but it just gives an example of how you could do this. So as always, if you've got any questions, please shout out, send them through. You can give me a call or email. And this is an opportunity now for you guys to plan and practice how you're going to learn, how you're going to apply this in your school with your students. There's a list of resources here that you can click to, which has got a bit more theory about the examples and non-examples, the curriculum links, and also the document I created with the examples and non-examples for capital letters. So we'll just close with a karakia. Anuhia, anuhia, anuhia ki te uru tapu nui, kia wātia, kia māma, te nākau, te tinana te wairua ki te ara tangata, koia rā e rongo. Whakairihia ake ki runga, kia tina, tina, hui e, tā ki e.